please. Thank you, Gerald.
Okay. This session actually came about because I did a previous one about a year ago on marginalization and how to tackle it using systems thinking. And just as an aside during the process, I said, oh, there's a whole other talk I've got on conflicts as well as marginalization. And somebody said, oh, why don't you do that next time? So that's what basically happened. We got a date in the diary and I'm here back doing this. So this is what I'd like to cover. I want to present a systems theory of entrenched value conflict. And I want to explore the implications of that for managing value conflicts. That will take us to 3 different ways of using systems approaches to help people move beyond those kinds of conflicts and find new ways forward. The reason I'm going to illustrate these with practical examples from New Zealand is because I actually worked out there for 7 years in a government research institute. So I was doing quite a lot of systems practice on wicked environmental problems, if you like. So that's what all the illustrations here are going to come from. And I'm going to end with something that is really obvious to any kind of systems practitioner, and that is the connection with decision making. You could either do work that's divorced from decision making and kind of handing over a report, or you can involve decision makers. And I don't think it's news that the latter is more useful. But I think it's worth reiterating that kind of message at the end. So I want to start with some basic theory about boundaries to understand conflict. The diagram that you see there represents a boundary judgment. That means the inclusion of stakeholders and issues or the exclusion of stakeholders and issues. It's simultaneously both one and the other. One of the fundamental assumptions of a systems approach is that everything in the world is either directly or indirectly connected with everything else, either immediately or through time, and that we can't have a God's eye view of that interconnectedness. We always draw boundaries. And that's what's represented in this diagram, the drawing of a boundary. So that's about the issues you include and the stakeholders that you listen to. Linked to that is a peak, which represents the purposes and values that drive the setting of boundaries. So we see that it's purposes and values that actually help us rethink boundaries, but also we come into institutions that already have boundary judgments made for us, and those actually make certain values easy to express or difficult to express. So there's a two-way relationship between boundaries and values, which is why there's a double-headed arrow here going between these two. Nevertheless, what I normally find in practice is that if you can start off talking about purposes and values, it opens the discussion about boundaries in a way that just talking about boundaries alone doesn't, because people usually interpret a boundary as a constraint. And actually, in the kind of theory, it's an enabling constraint. A boundary judgment both enables something to be done, but it also constrains other options. So this is the kind of picture of what it means to make boundary judgments. And this kind of theory comes from West Churchman from back in the 60s and 70s and Werner Ulrich in the 80s and 90s. Now, if we take that kind of model of a boundary judgment, and then we look at what happens when you have two stakeholders making different boundary judgments around the same thing. So you end up with competing frames. So what we have here is one boundary judgment made by one stakeholder, another boundary judgment made by another, and we have an area of common concern that is framed differently because of the connections with that common concern with people's separate concerns. So a typical example that I've come across a lot in the work in New Zealand was conflicts between environmentalists and farmers, where you have competing understandings of what water means. So water in a river might be seen as a resource for irrigation by a farmer, and it's seen by the environmentalists as a habitat for fragile native species. So people are seeing the same thing, but framing it so differently. So it literally means something different to different people. Those different framings then make sure that the elements of common concern are seen as really fundamentally different. And what happens after that is you end up with the conflict, and then you have, when it really starts to get entrenched, stereotyping of stakeholders and their framings by those on the other side. So if you take that example of environmentalists versus farmers, farmers start calling environmentalists tree huggers in a derogatory way, and the environmentalists start calling the farmers greedy exploiters, and it basically justifies seeing things in terms of one framing and derogating the other. So that's the basic model of conflict. And like all models, of course, a model is a simplification. So it's possible that this kind of a single conflict between two parties might intersect with other conflicts. So the reality can be a lot more complex than one single conflict, but it's easy, it's useful to visualize it like this. Now, once we see it like this, you can begin to think about some of the implications for managing value conflict. First of all, because everybody has a boundary judgment here, nobody's got that God's eye view, everybody has a partial understanding. Now, the word partial in the English language has two meanings, and both are relevant here. So partial as in incomplete, but also partial as in values informed. So there isn't an objective or neutral position here. Everybody has a partial understanding. But instead of seeing that as a problem, you can also see that as an opportunity, that there's a potential for development and change if everybody has a partial understanding. And that's an important starting point, because systems thinking facilitates that development of values and understandings and stakeholder relationships, and then it opens up new directions for systems for decision making. And I contrast that with a traditional economic approach, which often says, well, we can get underneath the problems, the positions people are taking, and find out people's fundamental interests. Now, the language of interests tend to mean that you then don't change those interests. Once you've discovered somebody's interests, they're fixed, and therefore the only way to move forward on that is to start looking at trade-offs. Whereas when you're talking about trade-offs, people tend to interpret it as I'm going to have to lose something, or I'm fighting not to lose something in the face of somebody else's understanding. Whereas if you're thinking in terms of development, it's possible for people to change their understandings, begin to move together, maybe find areas that they can accommodate, even if they have continuing disagreements. All of this becomes possible. And of course, if you can't resolve a conflict with dialogue, you can always fall back on trade-off thinking. But that wouldn't be my first place to go. Now, in the kinds of workshops I'm talking about, all stakeholders are given opportunities to express their viewpoints and listen to others. And it's worth saying that early intervention is often easier than intervention once a conflict is entrenched. But I have done several conflict resolution exercises where the conflict has been going for 25, 30 years. And one of the examples I'm going to give you later is exactly that situation, a generation-long conflict between environmental and economic values, where the regional council, which was responsible for environmental protection, was actually spending $3 million a month just on legal fees because they were fighting farmers who were basically challenging their environmental regulations. So we're back to this model again, and I want to suggest that the model suggests 3 different types of approach. So we've got approaches that improve mutual understanding. So those directly tackle the stereotyping of stakeholders. We've got approaches that make connections across boundaries. So you begin to see that things in one person's boundary, if I can bring my cursor up, that things in one person's boundary here might actually connect with things in the other person's boundary there. And there's transcending narrowly focused values, because once the conflict becomes entrenched, generally people find it very difficult then to see multiple perspectives and end up with quite narrow focus. And so an approach is to actually open up the focus to other possible values. So I'm going to start here with the first approach, improving mutual understanding, and I'm going to give you 2 case study examples of tackling things with this approach. And it's worth saying that all of the mature methodologies will probably do more than one of these things at a time, but I think it's useful to separate separate it into those 3 intervention points, because it helps you see ways into the conflict instead of seeing a conflict as just a monolithic entity. So the first project example I'm going to give was a project on expanding irrigation in the Wairarapa. The Wairarapa is a really dry farming area of New Zealand. It's mostly beef farming and sheep, which is really all you can do on dry land in New Zealand. And a lot of money was being made by the dairy industry. Now, in order to convert to dairy, the farmers needed to expand irrigation, but they knew that this was going to be controversial, because you've got a situation where a small group of farmers had already committed to doing it and wanted to persuade others, but the expense of building a dam was going to be too large for that small group of farmers to shoulder alone. So they were going to have to get everybody in the region to commit to co-funding the irrigation. If a farmer chose not to go in for it, but ended up paying for that irrigation and didn't want to change their land use, they would end up as being unprofitable, because it's the profitability of beef and lamb is marginal, whereas the profitability of dairy was quite huge. So everybody had to go with it, or nobody had to go with it. When we went in there, we had a discussion, and we asked them how open they are to hearing the perspectives of people who might not want to change their land use. And they actually said, if we can't get agreement with everybody, then we won't go ahead. So they were actually very open to the dialogue, but really believed it was in the interests of the whole region. We used an approach called Q-sort, which is usually operationalized as a quantitative method, but we used it in a qualitative way, and I'll show you how. So the first thing you do is you take the theme of whatever it is that people want to look at, and you find multiple value statements on this. So we trawled the media and the internet looking for value statements around water. Got a wide range of value statements. Also, some of that came from interviews with people in the locality. And we give the statements on cards to people and ask them to order them on a continuum as individuals from agree to disagree. And here's what it looks like. You can see these 2 men here are discussing their orderings. What they've done is put them on a normal distribution. So you've got just a few that they strongly disagree with, just a few that they strongly agree with, and then you've got a mass of ones they neither disagree or agree with in the middle. So they order them in that way, and it just helps people visualize in a very quick way the similarities and differences between each other. Now, we did this qualitatively, which meant that the people in the room were basically circulated around and had discussions about their similarities and differences, that was enough to get them to see whether they had enough in common to be able to move forward. It's possible to do this quantitatively as well. If you want to do it quantitatively, you basically take people's orderings like this, and you do a cluster analysis. And a cluster analysis doesn't cluster the value statements like a factor analysis would do. It clusters the people. So what you see is who thinks broadly similarly to you and who thinks in a different way to you. And that just shatters people's stereotypes, because they often have similarities with people that they thought they might disagree with. And people can discuss the implications of that. Now, we didn't do that quantitative phase because it just became completely obvious through the discussions between people that they broadly were in line, and they had really useful discussions about points of disagreement along the way. They went on in the end in this area to actually develop the irrigation. So this actually headed off a potential conflict rather than resolving one that already existed. The second one is quite different in some ways, although it's the same basic understanding about challenging stereotypes. This was a highly conflictual project where it was the genetic modification debate in New Zealand. This work was led by Karen Cronin, who's one of my colleagues in New Zealand, and I came in really at the latter end of it when we took her method that she'd been developing in this work on genetic modification, and we started using it in industry to begin to have dialogue around values, around controversial areas of industrial development. But in this case, we were looking at she was looking at genetic modification, and she brought in 12 leading protagonists in the genetic engineering debate, ranging from senior leaders in Monsanto through to spiritual leaders, Maori leaders, people in environmental movements, leading scientists on genetic modification. And one of the things you need to know about genetic modification in New Zealand is that the debate was far more heated than it ever was in the UK. So you got situations where people had their cars pelted with eggs, where there was abuse being hurled, people wouldn't be willing to talk together, really quite vitriolic slanging matches around this topic. So this is what the approach involves. So we Karen started by interviewing something like 90 different people with a stake in genetic modification to determine the values that mattered to people. And in a workshop, then people can order the issues from the core to the peripheral. And Karen talked about this as being a heart of the matter analysis. So what's at the heart of the matter for you? And one of the really interesting things here is that just about all of the stakeholders put environmental issues at the heart of the matter. And that completely blew apart the stereotypes, because the assumption amongst environmental groups, for example, is that the scientists doing the research on genetic modification wouldn't really be caring about the environmental issues. They kind of saw them as, before coming in, as being kind of in the pockets of business organizations, really more interested in the science than the environmental effects. But actually, issues of horizontal gene transfer, which is about how genetic material can escape from the organism into the environment, usually via a bacteria in the soil, this kind of thing, those kinds of issues were really important to the scientists. They were doing a lot of work on that. So that actually blew apart the stereotypes and started the possibility for a common ground discussion. And there were really only it was only on spiritual issues that there was really a difference between the scientists and the and some of the campaign groups in the situation, because the campaign groups often put spiritual issues quite high on their agenda, maybe the third ring out, whereas the scientists put that right at the edge. But there was enough commonality to enable a dialogue and for people to agree to disagree on that kind of issue. So people discuss their orderings. Again, you can do this quantitatively or qualitatively. In this case, it was done qualitatively, so people discuss their orderings, or you can take it away and do an analysis on it. Again, what you're doing is cluster analysis, so it's clustering the different stakeholders. I've done that myself in some work on attitudes to drugs policy. And again, it does blow apart the stereotypes people hold, because you really don't have such quite clear cut. It's a lot less clear cut than you expect, the alignment between particular stakeholder groups and particular perspectives. Now, one of the things that emerged from this is policy options that both sides could live with, like continuing with genetic experimentation, but in the lab, so it wouldn't escape. So there was enough commonality for real policy options to emerge. So I'm going to go on now to the second approach, and that's making connections across boundaries. On my page. So this diagram here, really don't pay attention to the detail of it. It's the fact that it's a complex causal loop model that matters. And the basic idea here, if you haven't seen these before, is that you're representing people's perceptions of causality in this kind of model. Now, the model comes from a project that my team in New Zealand did on the transmission of Campylobacter, which is a food poisoning bacterium, from animals, particularly dairy cattle, to humans via water. So New Zealand has the highest rate of Campylobacter food poisoning in the OECD countries, and the government wanted to know why. So they'd commissioned some scientists to investigate that, and they'd come out with the view that it's dairy cows pooing in the rivers, and human beings are picking up the bacteria through the water system, because a lot of the water that people drink in New Zealand is untreated, or was untreated at that time. Of course, that became immediate front page headlines of the newspapers, because actually the dairy industry accounts for more than 50%, I think it's something like 56% of New Zealand exports. So it's huge when somebody criticizes the dairy industry. So it was front page news, and words like dirty dairy were used. That sent the farmers union and farmers themselves into a really kind of outraged reply, and it got to the point where people were refusing to actually engage together. And a lot of the scientists' work actually depended on being able to have the cooperation with the farmers, and the farmers were threatening to withdraw their cooperation from the science, and it was getting very, very heated indeed. So our group was called on not to solve the problem around transmission of Campylobacter, but to help get the sides talking again so that you could have a reasonable discussion about it. And we approached that by working with them on causal loop modeling. So at the beginning, people weren't willing to actually go in a workshop together. So we talked with people independently in small groups. And the area at the top, for example, is the farmer's view about the human sewage system. The area to the left is the scientist's view about cows. And there were actually lots of other bits and pieces that were involved as well in people's modeling. And once they'd actually built their individual models, they were quite ready then to come together because they thought their task was going to be to justify their perspective to other stakeholders. But when we got them in the room, we did something a little naughty. We pulled the rug out from under them, because instead of asking them to justify their perspectives, we asked them instead to walk around the room and look at other people's models and find things that in those models that causally connected to things in their own models. And across a morning, we built up this kind of picture that you see here. And it gradually began to dawn on people that you can't talk about one area of Campylobacter infection in isolation from others. There was Campylobacter flowing through the whole system. And it just didn't make sense to bound the system in such narrow ways. Now, once people began to have that realization, they actually were started to talk reasonably again. And some of the interventions were really simple, like things like people washing their hands after they've been in fields with cattle. But the point is that we got the stakeholders back on side discussing again. And interestingly, the scientists were saying that this model will give them 10 years of research now to quantify it, which was a kind of spin-off benefit for them. Second one is the one I mentioned earlier, where the conflict had become really strong between farmers in the Canterbury region of New Zealand. So the agriculture and horticulture and forestry in Canterbury accounts for 40% of the exports of New Zealand. Again, therefore, it's massively important to the government of New Zealand. There'd been an entrenched conflict for 25 years. I'd been to public meetings where people were literally just standing up and screaming at each other. The conflict was so intense, with farmers basically saying that it's unacceptable that the regional council is restricting its water use, even though it's dry land, that they need access to the rivers. And you had the council itself and environmental stakeholders basically saying that Canterbury is one of the few places in the world that has braided rivers with its natural ecosystems intact, and those have to be protected against pollution at all costs. So we had that kind of conflict lasting for a generation. The council itself couldn't solve it initially. Well, for that 25 years, they were split 50-50 between urban stakeholders who took the environmental stance and rural stakeholders who took the farmers' stance. And so there were often ties in council meetings with only the chairs voting to be able to move it forward. So politics wasn't going to solve this problem. A new chief executive came in by the name of Brian Jenkins. And he should really have the credit for this work. I got called in to do some consultancy on it halfway through the program, but I'll talk you through what we did. So Brian Jenkins started after kind of getting his feet under the table in the job and learning about the situation. He hired a consultancy company to use open strategy, which is a systems approach strategy, to consult on the full range of values and uses around water. So they went out to literally every town and village in the region and held public meetings where they gathered value statements. And Brian came to me after that exercise was completed because they had 40,000 value statements about water. And he kind of said to me, what the hell can I do with 40,000 value statements? It's just too complex to deal with. So I was asking him if it's possible to condense those into key value statements. What's driving that amount of variety? And he said, well, it's often connected with local water bodies, but actually there's some standard themes. And so they condensed them into 10 key decision areas. or value statements that would have to be dealt with. So there were things like water quantity, how much can you take for irrigation, water quality, how pure is the water and will it support biodiversity, which was another area, climate change was another area. There were 10 areas in total that were defined. And I suggested to him that he works with a selection of key stakeholders who he knows have very deep feelings on the issues, but are still open-minded to listen to other perspectives. And he said, well, that's great because I've got an advisory board that is already in that position. So there's 20 people willing to do that. And I double-checked with him that these are people who will actually go back to their constituency and have that dialogue with them and won't just be closed in the room. And he said, absolutely, they will. So we ended up doing an exercise of strategic choice with them. And one of the core exercises in strategic choice is to identify decision areas. So we already had 10 of them, to look at what the policy options might be for each of those decision areas. And then you don't just look for the compatibilities between policy options in the different decision areas, you look for key incompatibilities, and that quickly separates out what you can and can't do together. So, for example, if you want to increase irrigation, you can't at the same time have improved water quality, because taking water out condenses the pollutants and lowers the water quality, unless that is you can find water from another source, which was one of the things that they actually did. And that allowed them to identify alternative feasible strategies, which they can then take out to consultation with the community. Now, there were 3 essential strategies. The first one was environmental protection above all else, so an absolute moratorium on taking more water for irrigation. And they have said in that case we simply sacrifice any of the goals for economic growth. The second option was economic growth above all else, in which case the environmental integrity of the rivers would be sacrificed, and they would simply accept they were going to be dammed, and the water would be used for irrigation. And the third strategy was one that evolved throughout the workshops, which was a really quite creative one, because they realized that a lot of the farmers were using out-of-date technology, and you could have a lot of water savings by using better methods for irrigation, and that there's also ice on the Alps, the mountains nearby, that could be used to irrigate rather than taking it from the rivers. So the third way was not a balance between environment and economics. It was a more creative solution. They ended up going for that, and they reduced water consumption by 80%. So while the option to build a dam was still on the table, they actually didn't need it, because they got the water either from the Alps or they had these massive water savings. Now, when we took out those options to public consultation, it was a completely different atmosphere. There were still people disagreeing in the room, but people were talking reasonably about it, and there was a consensus on that this third strategy was the one that needed to go forward. Now, that consensus really spread right across the Canterbury region, but it didn't extend to national government. And what happened is that national government ended up moving in, and they abolished the regional elected authority. They were so upset that they had found this third way, rather than going for economic development above all else, that they abolished the elected authority and put in a quango of 12 government-appointed individuals to run the water system, with a view to them overturning this water strategy. And one of the amazing things that shows the robustness of this work was that it only took them 2 weeks to reaffirm the strategy, because once they actually talked to all the stakeholders and realized how difficult it was going to be to get any kind of agreement if they didn't follow this strategy, they actually changed their mind. So it kind of shows you the robustness of this kind of systems work, mixing the bridging of boundaries with widespread community engagement. So now on to the third approach here, which is around transcending narrowly focused values. In this case, I'm going to only show one case study in the interest of brevity, because I think my time's going to come to an end soon. This is a case where, again, it's a situation where a group of farmers wanted to build a dam, and they wanted us to do a feasibility study for that dam. But we said we wouldn't do that if they take as a starting point that they must have a dam. Why don't we open up the possibility that there could be other options? Now, they'd done some research to show that water was already 20% over allocated in the region. And during our work on this, we had scientists doing some further work, and they were actually ended up showing that they were 60% over allocated. So drought was a major problem, and there was no potential for expanding industry if there wasn't some kind of dam. Now, what we were told in no uncertain terms is that this has to, if we want to have widespread community consultation, we have to do that in the format of a 2.5 hour public meeting. So it was a challenge to us to develop a systems approach that you could actually implement in just 2.5 hours and could be really quite tightly facilitated. So what we ended up doing is running 2 workshops. We ran a workshop with the landowners and some of the other stakeholders related to farming. And we ran a second workshop with the community, anglers, kayakers, all the various other stakeholders, hunters, there were bird watchers, all sorts of people came to that second workshop. And some of the farmers came in as observers so they could see what other people were saying. And we started the workshop with key facts about water systems. It was just 10 minutes on showing people how the rivers connect underground, because we didn't want them to make naive assumptions about what was possible without having some of that biophysical knowledge. It just took 10 minutes to do that. And then we explored meanings of drought to different stakeholders. That was really important because we needed people to hear that drought was important to everyone. It's not just the farmers who wanted more water for irrigation, but kayakers couldn't kayak properly if the rivers were low. Anglers couldn't get the fish if the rivers were low, these kinds of things. Then we identified values that mattered. We used a diagram a bit like that heart of the matter diagram I put up earlier, except it was less rings. And we identified values that mattered to different groups. And then we simply took large sheets of paper and we put various options for water management that people had identified along the top, and the values that mattered to people along the bottom. And we asked people to go into small groups and evaluate the options against the full range of values. And these were qualitative statements put in, not numbers. And it was really interesting. The small group I was in, for example, there was a woman there who was absolutely saying at the beginning that we mustn't have a new dam. And then when she listened to people, and she began to realize that actually they couldn't address drought without a dam, because water conservation would only achieve about 10% water efficiencies, and it was already more over allocated than that. So a dam was going to have to be an option. Then the question became what kind of dam, and also how could you stop the region getting into this state in future. So a lot of people were saying, if we build a dam, the farmers are just going to put more land into productive use, and we're going to go back into the same situation in 10 years' time where we're going to be over allocated. So let's have a sustainability policy that allows more water to be taken, but with limits, so that you don't get into that same over-allocated position in future. And that's the policy that emerged from that work. So we reported that as part of a feasibility study. But I think the real gains actually happened in those workshops. And I think the proof of that comes in what happened after this project was over, because the council, in its wisdom, we'd actually investigated 2 possible rivers that could be dammed, and stakeholders had a clear preference on one of those 2 rivers. And the council, in its wisdom, suddenly announced that it was going to look at a 3rd river. And when they put it out for public consultation, all of the objections were to damming that 3rd river. And because it had already been worked through on the other 2 rivers, what the option was, and what they ended up doing was go back to the river that everybody had agreed on. So what I've done is present these 3 different approaches to intervening in value conflicts. We've got the challenging of stereotypes, we've got the making links across boundaries, and we've got the transcending narrow value positions. But I just want to end with a few words on connecting with decision making, because you can do this kind of participative work and then report to decision makers. That is the usual approach. The alternative is to actually involve the decision makers in workshops, and that actually allows them to learn directly from engaging with people who bring different perspectives into the room. It's the reason why in that last project I mentioned, we brought the farmers into the room, but silently listening, so they could hear what the stakeholders were saying. And they were shocked that productive land use and profitability of the farms was pretty low down on people's list of priorities. And they were saying to us afterwards, a lot of these people are employed by us. Don't they realize that they're going to bring their own jobs into question if they don't affect this? But that listening really made a difference to them, because they understood how they could actually address a broader range of values. So direct engagement can support deeper learning than just reading a report, so it's much more likely to inform decision making. Now, I appreciate there are some contexts, and government is one of them, where that's very difficult indeed. You can get the civil servants involved, but it's often very difficult to get the politicians involved. I've had a few projects where I've been able to bridge that with the politicians as well, but more often or not, they will just want to reserve the final decision. Nevertheless, the more participation you can get, the better, in my view. So I'll leave it there and open up to comments and questions. Thank you.
Gerald, thank you so much for that. It's fascinating to see how the dynamics of the interactions worked. Any quick, we have time for about 10 minutes worth of questions. I see straight away Miles' hand up and William's hand up. So can I go to William first, please? You're on mute at the moment. There you go. We can hear you.
It's not actually a hand up, it was a clap.
Oh, oh, fair enough. Thank you.
So congratulations. Thank you very much for that talk.
Russ, you do have a hand up.
I do, thank you. I think Jesse got a hand up before I did, though.
Yeah, this is another great rendition of this general method of exposing people to the context in a way that lets them make better choices, which they don't do when they're thinking by themselves, stewing in the closet or whatever. Now, in the US, we have 2 very large groups of people at each other's throats constantly. Who is going to be wise enough to ask for help? Because it seems that if they both are highly devoted to America, with totally different understandings of what that means, and has changed the language substantially so that it's doubly hard to communicate.
Mm.
Anyway, who would ask for help?
This is the issue, is getting people in the room in the first place. In each of these conflict situations, people had reached a point where they were well, we could create the conditions where they would be ready to talk. And I have seen experiments online bringing people with very different political persuasions in the US together in a social setting to have dialogues. And it really does. It is possible to bridge those kinds of perspectives. But the way politics is constructed actually militates against that. It's the reason why in the late 1980s, I chose to leave politics. I used to be a member of a political party, and I chose to leave because I found that it was conflict all the way down. You would often have two factions. Not only do you have two political parties, in the UK it's Labour and Conservative vying, but then within the parties you often have two factions over every issue. And then within those factions you have two more factions vying for it. It's just conflict all the way down, and it's a simplistic construction of arguments. And as I began to see myself being forced by other people to take sides, I said it's time to withdraw, because I can actually, I'd got to the point now, at this point, where I realized that I was wanting to work in systems thinking, and this was a better way, basically. So I chose to step out.
Excellent. Thank you, Jesse. And Joe, I want
Mine's
to give
quick.
Russ a chance to ask your question, Russ.
Yeah,
please.
mine's going to be very quick. Gerald, I did a quick search and I can't find anything recent from you apart from 2 calls for papers, which was very tempting. Have you published anything? You said that this is a new systems theory of value conflict. So I'm researching ambidexterity, so I'm interested in the microfoundations, and this could be lovely, but it's the conflict that interests me. Anything published? Maybe you can put it in the chat as we go through the next lecture.
Yeah, there's a working paper, a research memorandum from 2016 that has this talk, and it's in a conference proceeding as well. I've got it half turned into a journal paper, and I haven't finished it yet. It's been sitting there for about 3 years waiting to get finished.
Partly anything you could share, I would.
Yeah, well, I'll share the I'll share. Am I able to upload a document to the chat?
You could, yes,
I think
and
you
you can put
can.
a link as well.
Yeah, you should be able to do a link.
Yeah, there
Thank
isn't.
you so much.
Unfortunately, the university, in its wisdom, when it refreshed our websites, wiped out all our research memoranda. So I've got a copy on my.
I'll put my email directly, so in case.
Okay.
If that's easier, and then let
yeah.
Tony carry on with the proceedings. Thank you so much. A wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Any other questions or thoughts? I mean, there are quite a few questions in the chat. Interestingly, Joe raised a whole series of questions around the subject of values, about sort of, what are value statements, what are values, to what extent, how do values sort of relate? I don't know whether you wanted to comment to that, Gerald, about the idea of what are values, how do they work, how are they structured? Okay, so the way I use the term values, there are different views on how you use the term values. I use it to mean the things that matter to people in a context of action. And I'm very specific about that, because I'm not talking about general virtues like kindness or benevolence or these sorts of things. It's what matters to people in the context of action. So it's a little bit broader than purposes, because you can say purposes. Let's think of an example. So an environmentalist may want to be protecting the aquatic environment for native species, and their values may be around biodiversity. So that's a little bit broader than just protecting this river. Yeah, interesting. Jesse asked another question on the chat, which I think is about there being a profession of constructive engagement facilitators. I would argue it's people like you and other systems thinkers, but the issue seems to be not whether there are people, but whether there are others willing to allow us to be engaged, perhaps. Yeah, I mean, all I can say is that I feel like we've gone past a tipping point on this now. And I can only say that about the UK. I can't comment about the USA. The USA seems to be particularly entrenched still. But
if you think about the systems thinking community of practice in government now, last year there were 300 members of it. This year there's 600. That's a doubling in 1 year of people who are self-identifying as systems thinkers in government. I mean, that's hugely encouraging. I mean, we all hope it's not just a fad, but still, it means that there are a lot of people out there appreciating that you can't handle complexity using some of the more traditional approaches if you really want to get somewhere on these kinds of wicked problems.
Cool. Thank you. I think I'm going to bring it sort of to a close because I think we are ready for a break. Oh, but actually one last hand up. So William, if your question is quick and you can go for a quick answer, then we can fit you in.
Yeah, it was just you know, within software development, user stories, user cases. Is there a similarity here in terms of the way in which you express value?
Okay.
It's interesting you said value there. That, I mean, I would make a distinction between value and values, because people talk about value in relation to what they can get out of something, and values I think are more to do with what's surrounding what matters to people in relation to that context of action. Value tends to be perverted often into a more economic kind of analysis.
So I'll give you an example. As a fisherman, I would like to have water quality that is able to support the indigenous fish of that. So that would be a value statement that you would expect to see.
Yes, that makes sense.
Yeah. So in actual fact, there is a certain similarity between the two, and then there's a simple method that one could use to actually enable people to make these statements.
Yes. Yes, I did have an interesting discussion with somebody in one of a large multinational. I won't say which, but they were talking a lot about value mapping. And when I said the word value in that context and the values it's the same basic root. This guy was absolutely shocked, and he was saying, "You're right. We can actually think in values terms." And then I was saying, and think about service too. That service has those double meanings. You've got service as in commercial service, but service as in service to others. And yeah, we had an interesting discussion.
Interesting. Thank you, Gerald. Thank you ever so much, Gerald, for coming and speaking to us and sort of opening up this really interesting space once again, of course. And I hope that that your session tomorrow, whatever you're doing, that leaves you to be away from home in a hotel room, is okay.